They thought they had the upper hand. Two officers, a routine traffic stop. But what they didn't know was that the woman behind the wheel wasn't just another driver. She was about to turn their world upside down. It was supposed to be an ordinary stop on a quiet stretch of highway, a chance for two officers to flex their authority on a driver who seemed out of place. But nothing about this day was ordinary. The woman they just pulled over wasn't some random traveler. She was Kendra Hayes, and today wasn't just any day. It was her first day as the new chief of police in Cedarview. As Kendra drove toward the city, the rising sun bathed the road in a golden glow. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, not from nervousness, but from the weight of the challenge ahead. Cedarview had a reputation, deeply rooted biases, and a police department resistant to change. Kendra had heard the murmurs, the discontent among the ranks when her appointment was announced. A black woman, stepping into a role traditionally held by men who looked nothing like her. She knew the road ahead would be rough, but she wasn't one to back down from a fight. Approaching a red light, her rearview mirror lit up with flashes of red and blue. The siren's wail pierced the quiet morning. A patrol car. Kendra's heart quickened, not from fear but from a sense of anticipation. She knew exactly what was about to happen. She pulled over, her tires crunching against the gravel shoulder, and waited. Two officers stepped out. The senior officer, a burly man with a weathered face, carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the badge gave him unchecked power. His younger partner followed, his face set in a mix of arrogance and suspicion. Together, they approached her car, their postures screaming authority. License and registration, the senior officer barked, leaning into her window, his tone clipped and commanding. Kendra calmly reached into her glove compartment, her movements deliberate. She handed over the documents without a word. Her face betrayed nothing, though inside, she felt a simmering frustration. This wasn't her first encounter with officers who assumed too much, and it wouldn't be her last. The younger officer peered into the car, his eyes narrowing. "What brings you out here?" he asked, his voice laced with condescension. "This area's not exactly safe for someone like you." Kendra's jaw tightened. She knew what he meant. She'd heard it all before. But she kept her composure, her voice calm and steady. "I'm on my way to work," she replied. "And where's that?" the younger officer pressed, his smirk widening as though he already had her figured out. Kendra paused. She could have ended the game right there, told them who she was. But something held her back. She wanted to see how far they would take this charade. "You'll find out soon enough," she said evenly, locking eyes with him. Her tone was polite, but her gaze made it clear. She wasn't intimidated. The senior officer stepped in, sensing his partner's bravado might escalate things. "Let's not make this difficult, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with false civility. "We can take this further if we need to." There it was, the veiled threat, the flex of power they thought they had. But Kendra had enough. She'd been silent long enough. Taking a deep breath, she decided it was time to flip the script. "That won't be necessary," she said firmly. "I'm Chief Kendra Hayes, your new boss. And I think it's time we had a serious conversation about how you treat the citizens of Cedarview." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Both officers froze, their faces a mix of disbelief and panic. The younger officer's smirk vanished, replaced with wide-eyed shock. The senior officer stammered, "You're the chief?" Kendra nodded, her gaze unyielding. "That's right. And now, I'd like to know why I was stopped and subjected to this line of questioning." Neither officer could muster a coherent response. The power dynamic had shifted, and they knew it. The younger officer fumbled for an excuse, but Kendra cut him off, her voice razor-sharp. "This isn't just a misunderstanding. This is exactly the problem with this department. You assume, you judge, and you act like you're above the very laws you're supposed to uphold." The senior officer opened his mouth to protest, but Kendra didn't let him. She stepped out of her car, standing tall, her presence commanding. "From now on, you'll both be reporting directly to me. And let me be clear, I'll be reviewing every single traffic stop you make. So, think very carefully about how you conduct yourselves moving forward." The senior officer swallowed hard, nodding quickly. "Understood, Chief. It won't happen again." But Kendra knew better. Words were easy, actions were harder. As she got back into her car and drove away, she couldn't help but reflect on the battle ahead. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been unfairly targeted, every citizen who had lost faith in the system. And it was her job to change that. Later that day, as she stood before the department for her first official meeting, she didn't hold back. "This morning, I had an encounter that reminded me exactly why I'm here," she began, her voice steady but firm. "Let me make one thing clear. Bias, disrespect, and abuse of power will no longer be tolerated in Cedarview. If you can't handle that, you're welcome to leave now." The room was silent, tension thick in the air. But Kendra didn't flinch. She had fought too hard to get here, and she wasn't about to let fear or resistance stop her. "This is your chance to prove that you're the kind of officers this community deserves. But if you're not ready to change, I will make sure you're held accountable." As she looked around the room, Kendra could see it, the shifting tide. Some officers were uncomfortable, others were intrigued, and a few even seemed inspired. It wouldn't be easy, but she was ready for the fight. Because this wasn't just a job, it was a mission. And Kendra Hayes had never backed down from a mission. Kendra's words echoed through the briefing room, a bold declaration that left the department in stunned silence. As she scanned the faces of her officers, she could see the emotions playing out, resentment in some, respect in others, and confusion in many. This was just the beginning. After the meeting, Kendra retreated to her new office, its walls still adorned with pictures of the previous chief. She didn't sit down immediately. Instead, she stood by the window, her eyes fixed on the bustling street outside. Cedarview was a town that wore its scars in plain sight. Boarded-up businesses, graffiti-covered walls, and neighborhoods divided by invisible lines of race and class. This wasn't just a broken system. It was a broken community. And if Kendra was going to fix it, she would have to start from within. A sharp knock on her door broke her thoughts. She turned to see Deputy Arthur Reeves, the second-in-command she'd inherited, a man with a reputation for walking the line between duty and defiance. "Chief," Reeves began, his tone formal but edged with skepticism. "A word?" "Of course," Kendra said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. She took her seat, leveling her gaze at him. Reeves didn't sit. Instead, he crossed his arms and stood by the door. "This morning's incident with Officers Mills and Carter. It's caused quite a stir." "I expected as much," Kendra replied evenly. Reeves frowned, his jaw tightening. "You called them out publicly. That kind of humiliation doesn't sit well with guys like Mills. Word travels fast, and now the department's on edge. They think you're here to make an example out of them." Kendra leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. "Deputy Reeves, let me be clear. I'm not here to make examples. I'm here to fix what's broken. And if that means ruffling a few feathers, so be it." Reeves held her gaze, the tension in the room thickening. "And you think calling out officers in front of the entire department is the way to do that?" Kendra's voice didn't waver. "What I think is that accountability starts at the top. If Mills and Carter can't handle being held to the same standard as the citizens they serve, then maybe they don't belong in this department." For a moment, Reeves said nothing. Then he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You've got guts, Chief. I'll give you that. But you're walking into a den of wolves, and some of them are already sharpening their teeth. Then I suggest they tread carefully," Kendra said, her tone razor-sharp, "because I'm not the one they should be worried about." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Kendra decided to take a drive through Cedarview. She wanted to see the town not from the safety of her office, but from the streets where its people lived and struggled. Her unmarked car rolled through neighborhoods that told stories of neglect and resilience. Children played on cracked sidewalks, their laughter defying the gloom around them. Elderly residents sat on porches, their faces etched with years of hardship. But as Kendra turned onto a quieter street, her gut tightened. A patrol car was parked on the curb, its lights off, but its presence unmistakable. Two officers stood by a young man who was pressed against the hood of the car, his hands cuffed behind his back. Kendra pulled over and stepped out, her badge prominently displayed. The officers turned, their expressions shifting from annoyance to unease as they recognized her. "Evening, Chief," one of them said, his voice strained. "What's going on here?" Kendra asked, her tone calm but firm. "Routine stop," the other officer replied quickly. The suspect matched the description of someone we've been looking for. Kendra's eyes moved to the young man, his face streaked with sweat and fear. "Is that so?" she said, her gaze snapping back to the officers. "And what exactly was the description?" The first officer hesitated, and that was all Kendra needed to see. "Uncuff him," she ordered. "Chief, with all due respect." "Uncuff him," Kendra repeated, her voice like steel. Reluctantly, the officers obeyed. The young man rubbed his wrists, his eyes darting between Kendra and the officers. "You okay?" she asked him gently. He nodded, though his body was still tense. "I didn't do anything. They just pulled me over and started questioning me." Kendra turned back to the officers. "You'd better have a damn good reason for this, or we're going to have a serious problem." The first officer stammered. It was a misunderstanding, Chief. We thought." "That's your problem." Kendra cut him off. "You thought. You didn't investigate. You didn't ask. You assumed. And now you've just lost whatever trust this young man might have had in the police." The officers looked down, chastened but not contrite. Kendra stepped closer, her voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. "This stops now. If I catch either of you, or anyone else in this department, pulling stunts like this again, you'll be handing in your badges. Am I clear?" "Yes, Chief," they mumbled. As Kendra watched them drive off, she turned to the young man. "What's your name?" "Jamal," he said quietly. "Jamal, I'm sorry this happened to you," Kendra said. "If you ever have trouble with this department again, you come straight to me. Understand?" Jamal nodded, gratitude flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, Chief." As he walked away, Kendra stood alone under the streetlights, her heart heavy but resolute. This was why she was here. To fight battles others couldn't. To hold the line where no one else would. Because change wasn't just coming to Cedarview. It was here. The following morning, Kendra walked into the precinct with a renewed sense of purpose. Last night's encounter with Jamal wasn't just a reminder of the uphill battle she faced. It was a challenge, a call to action that echoed louder with every step she took down the precinct hallway. She pushed open the door to the briefing room, where the usual pre-shift chatter quieted as soon as the officers noticed her. All eyes turned to her, and she could feel the weight of their skepticism, their resentment, and their unspoken questions. She didn't flinch. Instead, she strode to the podium with the confidence of someone who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. "Before we start," Kendra began, her voice slicing through the silence, "I need to address something." The officers exchanged wary glances. "Last night, I intervened in an incident involving two of our own," she continued, her tone steady but sharp. "An incident where a young man was detained without probable cause. I don't need to name names. You know who you are." Her gaze swept the room, daring anyone to look away. A few did, their discomfort obvious. "This department has a choice to make," Kendra said, her voice rising. "We can either keep doing things the way we've always done them, ignoring the rules when it suits us, abusing the trust of the very people we're sworn to protect, or we can start holding ourselves accountable. Not just for the sake of the law, but for the sake of this community." A murmur rippled through the room, but Kendra wasn't finished. "And let me be clear," she added, her tone hardening. "If you can't or won't be part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And I will not hesitate to show the door to anyone who chooses to be part of the problem. This isn't a threat. It's a promise." She let the words hang in the air for a moment before stepping back from the podium. "Now, let's get to work." The room remained silent as she walked out, the tension palpable. But Kendra wasn't looking for immediate applause or approval. Change took time, and she was ready for the fight ahead. Kendra spent the afternoon reviewing cases in her office, focusing on complaints of misconduct that had been swept under the rug. The sheer volume of them was staggering. Each one a story of someone who had been failed by the system, by the very people meant to protect them. Her focus was broken by the buzz of her intercom. It was her assistant, Carla. "Chief, there's someone here to see you," Carla said. "Who is it?" It's Jamal. Kendra frowned, surprised. Send him in. A moment later, Jamal stepped into her office. He was dressed in the same worn hoodie he'd been wearing the night before, his hands shoved into his pockets. He looked nervous but determined. Jamal, Kendra said, gesturing for him to sit. What brings you here? He hesitated before sitting down. I wanted to say thank you. For last night. You don't need to thank me, Kendra replied. I was just doing my job. That's the thing, Jamal said, his voice quiet but firm. Most cops wouldn't have done what you did. They wouldn't have cared. Kendra leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. Jamal, what happened to you wasn't right. And it's my job to make sure it doesn't happen again. To you or anyone else. Jamal nodded, but didn't look convinced. You're just one person. How are you going to change all of this? Kendra paused, considering her words carefully. One step at a time, she said finally. And I'm not doing it alone. People like you. Your voice matters. If you see something wrong, speak up. Hold us accountable. That's how we make change. Jamal studied her for a moment, then nodded again. All right, I'll try. As he stood to leave, Kendra stopped him. Wait, if you ever need anything, if you ever feel unsafe or see something that needs fixing, you come to me. No matter what. Understand? Jamal hesitated, then gave her a small, grateful smile. Yeah, I understand. The brewing storm. That evening, as Kendra locked up her office, Deputy Reeves appeared in the doorway. He looked tired, his usual confidence tinged with unease. Chief, he began, stepping inside. We've got a situation. What kind of situation? Kendra asked, her instincts immediately on high alert. Word spreading, Reeves said, shutting the door behind him. About last night. About what you said in the briefing this morning. Some of the officers, they're not happy. They think you're coming down too hard, too fast. Kendra folded her arms, her expression unreadable. And what do you think, Reeves? Reeves hesitated, then sighed. I think you're doing the right thing, but you need to be careful. There are people here who've been playing by their own rules for a long time. They're not just going to roll over because you say so. I'm not asking them to roll over, Kendra said. I'm asking them to do their jobs. If they can't handle that, they're in the wrong profession. Reeves nodded, though his worry was evident. Just watch your back, Chief. Not everyone's on your side. Kendra met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. I don't need everyone on my side, Reeves. I just need enough people to do the right thing. The rest will take care of itself. As Reeves left, Kendra sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She knew the road ahead would be treacherous, but for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope. Because no matter how many lines were drawn in the sand, Kendra was determined to cross them. Back at the precinct, the tension boiled over. News of the complaint had spread, and factions within the department were beginning to form. Some officers openly voiced their support for Kendra, while others sided with Mills and Carter, claiming Kendra's methods were too harsh. Kendra called a department-wide meeting that afternoon. As the officers gathered in the briefing room, the atmosphere was charged. Conversations buzzed with thinly veiled hostility and curiosity. Kendra stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding attention. When the room fell silent, she spoke. I've heard the whispers, she began. I know some of you are uncomfortable with the changes happening here. I know some of you think I'm being too hard on you. But let me ask you this. Why does accountability feel like an attack? Her words hung in the air, sharp and unrelenting. For too long, this department has operated on a system of privilege, where some of you believed you could act without consequences, where certain members of this community were treated like they didn't belong. That ends now. Mills shifted in his seat, his expression dark. Kendra noticed but didn't flinch. I'm not here to make enemies, she continued. I'm here to make this department what it should be, a force that serves and protects everyone equally. If that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe it's time to ask yourself why. Murmurs rippled through the room, but Kendra raised her hand, silencing them. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice steady. This is about Cedarview, about the people who look at us and see a system that doesn't work for them. We have the power to change that, but it starts with each of you. She let her words settle before delivering the final blow. For those of you who aren't willing to be part of the solution, my door is always open. For your resignation, the room erupted into murmurs again. But this time, there was an undercurrent of respect. Kendra had drawn the line in the sand, and now it was up to them to decide which side they stood on. In the weeks that followed, Kendra's leadership began to take effect. Officers like Mills and Carter found themselves under increased scrutiny, their every action monitored and evaluated. Some adapted, realizing that the old ways were no longer acceptable. Others left, unable to adjust to the new standards. Kendra initiated community outreach programs, inviting residents to share their concerns directly with the department. She hosted workshops on implicit bias, making attendance mandatory for all officers. Slowly but surely, the culture within the precinct began to shift. Jamal returned to Kendra's office one afternoon, this time with a smile on his face. "Chief," he said, "you told me to speak up if I saw something wrong. Well, I've been talking to people in my neighborhood. They're starting to notice the difference. They say it feels safer now." Kendra smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's the goal, Jamal. One step at a time." Months later, Kendra stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd that had gathered to celebrate Cedar View's transformation. The community had come together in ways no one thought possible, and Kendra's leadership was at the heart of it all. "This isn't about me," she told the crowd. "This is about us. About what we can accomplish when we hold each other accountable, when we treat each other with respect, and when we fight for justice together. Cedar View isn't perfect, but we're on the right path. And as long as we keep moving forward, we'll get there." As the crowd erupted into applause, Kendra looked out at the faces before her. Faces filled with hope, determination, and gratitude. She knew the fight wasn't over. But in that moment, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. Because Cedar View had become more than just a town. It was a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept the status quo. And Kendra Hayes was proud to stand at its heart, leading the charge for a better tomorrow. Thanks for watching.